Ah, there you are. Nobody is not talking about the coronavirus, and I don't want to be nobody, so I'm going to talk about the coronavirus as well. And you probably have the time to sit through this presentation because you're likely in lockdown mode if you're a South African in any event, and you have the next 21 days to figure out ways to not go completely insane and to keep yourself busy. So you might even do something really wonderful, such as reading a book by the end of this. But yes, some ideas on the coronavirus. You've probably read and seen a lot of ideas, and I have some ideas of my own for your entertainment. So sit back, relax, buckle up because it's going to be quite a ride. In 1920, while the world was still reeling from the ravages of the Spanish flu, which had taken more lives in its wake than did the First World War that directly preceded it, some very interesting things were happening in the Middle East. You see, the Ottoman Empire had reigned over most of the Middle East for the better part of 500 years. And at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire came to an end. It was a good empire. Actually, they did a lot of good, but their time had come. Well, really, because they had for many years been the old sick man of Europe, but the final nail in the coffin was the fact that they sided with the Germans in the First World War. They were their allies, and as is often the case for countries who are on the losing side of a global conflict, it didn't turn out all that well for them. So, yes, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled, and their territories that we know from Bible times, such as Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which is where Iraq is today, and Persia, which is where Iran is today. All these territories were divided up amongst the Russians and the British and the French to varying degrees for their protection or their authority. But one of the areas that was left to govern itself was Arabia. And as is often the case when a country is ruled by a foreign power for such a long time and the foreign power leaves, then there's not really an infrastructure in place, a power structure in place, and the locals have to figure out who's going to be the next big Kanoni. And Arabia was a collection of clans and tribes who sort of fought it out to see who's going to be the dominant one. And eventually, the one that overcame, the one that ruled them all, was the House of Saud. And that's where Saudi Arabia comes from. They were very clever, you see. They gave their name to the country to make sure that they will, for all posterity, be associated with the leadership of that country. That was in the early 20s. Oil had not been discovered in Saudi Arabia just yet. This had to wait until 1936. Fast forward to the Second World War, a global conflict, the biggest conflict known to mankind, terrible toll in human lives and economic consequences, but also wonderful advances in technology, and the world had suddenly become a much smaller, more accessible place, directly as a consequence of the Second World War. However, towards the end of the Second World War, the Allied nations realized that they had to do something to save the economy, because if the whole world has been fighting for 5 years, pouring all of their resources into things that go kaboom and then are never to be seen again, and not really winning any land and trying not to lose any land, but losing many, many, many brave and often foolish young men, they realized that they have to do something to save the world economy. So over 700 delegates from over 40 countries got together in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire in the United States to talk about the future of the world economy and to make a few agreements and sign a few protocols. And there's a lot of detail about that which you can do a lot of research on, but the one that interests me the most for the purpose of this presentation is that it was decided that the dollar was going to be used as a global reference currency. These are my own words, but it's something like that. You see, what they needed was a currency that would be stable in terms of its value reference. And to explain this to you, let's say Turkey wanted to buy bananas from Brazil. The Turkish have their lira, the Brazilians have their real, and the Brazilians aren't really sure how real the lira is and what its value is, and besides, what use do they have for lira out in Brazil? And the same for the Turks. If the Brazilians want to buy something from Turkey, what use do they have for lira? It's you can't use it here in Brazil. So they need an international currency, and you might ask, why was that need not satisfied a long time ago? Well, it had been in some way, because until the First World War, and also between the First World War and the Second World War to a large degree, much of the world fell under colonial domains. The French held large parts of the world, the English held large parts, the Spanish, the Portuguese. And if you were a Portuguese colony, Mozambique or Angola or Brazil, and you wanted to do business, you did so in the Portuguese currency. And if you were a British subject or a British colony, then no matter where you were in the world, you would work with the pound, and so on and so forth. And so there was a form of financial stability which always came from a higher, more powerful place. But it just so happened that exactly at the time that the world became a lot smaller, because everything expanded and transport and technology made the world more accessible, these great empires slowly started falling apart or dismantling themselves. And there was a need for an international currency. And the dollar was very well positioned to fill that position, because in the 40s, 60% of the world's oil was produced in the United States, and they held just about 60% of the world's gold in the United States as well. So there's a good start. However, there was a condition, and that condition was that the American dollar has to be pegged to the gold for its value. The American dollar would get its value in terms of gold. It was backed by gold. And that worked very well. So after the Second World War, international trade went along famously. It was a wonderful time for the world to go forth and use the technology that had been developed during wartime, but for peacetime efforts, and invest a lot of money in many projects and rebuild the world after the devastation of the Second World War. And Turkey could buy dollars and buy bananas in dollars from Brazil, and Brazil could buy, I don't know, what would you buy from Turkey? Cloth or something, and also pay them in dollars. But where do they get their dollars from? They get their dollars from the United States. And how do they get their dollars from the United States? They give them gold. Here's some gold, give me some dollars so I have something that I can trade with. It's not the only way, but that's a good way. Be it as it may, the dollar was a very important currency, and it chugged along wonderfully after the Second World War. However, it wasn't long after the Second World War that some divisions amongst the Allies reared its ugly head, because the West saw that they don't like the East, and the Soviet Union realized they don't like the USA, France, Britain, etc. And the Iron Curtain came up, and suddenly there was this great division, the beginning of the Cold War. And throughout the Cold War, there were proxy wars in different places of the world fought between these two sides of the conflict. The Soviet Union and the USA never fought their battles on their own territory. They would do that in other places, such as North Korea and South Korea in the 50s, and such as Vietnam in the 60s. And during the war in Vietnam, you know, to understand what it must have been like in America at the time, you need to look at America today. Because in my just about 50 years of life on this planet, I have never seen America quite as divided as it is today. It's left and right and white and black and male and female and young and old, and from every corner there seems to be this conflict, and the flames are being fanned, and it's quite a horrible state, because America has always been I'm going to call them America. I prefer to say the United States of America, but it's so long, so let's just go with America. America is a country known for its patriotism and its focus amongst its people, because it's easy to stick together when you are on top, when you are the most powerful country and a very wealthy country, etc. But they are very divided now, and they have been for at least a decade. And they were that divided in the 1960s during the Vietnam War. And there were the same things that we see today, protests and young people breaking things and shouting, and old people not breaking things but also shouting, and the sides seem irreconcilable, and the whole country is in turmoil as a consequence. But at the time, for the rest of the world, it didn't paint a very good picture, because they saw, right, this great nation is divided, A. B, we have our reservations as to the moral authority of this great nation, because we're not really in agreement that this is a good war. The problem with Vietnam is the majority of the Vietnamese wanted to be communist. It's so frustrating. I'm America, and I don't want communism to be something anywhere, and I'm going to tell these people you can't be communist, but they want to be communist. So America interfered in Vietnam, trying to change the mind of the majority of the people, and that's never a good war to fight. And in the third place, C, the rest of the world looked at America and started having reservations about their military prowess, because America was not doing too well in that war. Well, they were killing a lot more people than the amount of people that were killed on their side, but they lost many lives, and basically they were not winning the war, and that's very important. Same thing that happened in Afghanistan, but then again, Afghanistan has always been the one that breaks the backs of empires, as the Soviet Union would learn before the US learned that lesson. Anyway, so Vietnam was not going too well. The world was losing faith, and the world started thinking, well, you know, maybe we should get some of our gold back just to cover our rear. And they started giving some of Turkey and Brazil and a bunch of other countries were like giving the dollars back and saying, well, you know, just give us a piece of that gold back. We just want to balance the risk a bit. So there was a massive outflow of gold from the United States, which made the US very nervous, and it also made them nervous because it meant that the dollar was not that much in circulation. If people are buying back their gold and leaving the dollars in the States, it means the dollar is not doing its magic in the rest of the world. And it's very useful if your currency is used all over the world, for reasons I'll explain later. So in 1971, in August 1971, it was August 15, President Nixon said he was going to make an announcement, and everybody was very excited about this announcement. Now, here in South Africa, we know what that's like, because I'm going to digress for a while. In 1986, the then president of South Africa, P.W. Botha, was not a very popular guy internationally, but he was the leader of the country. And he said he was going to make an announcement. And what the international media did was they said he's probably going to announce that he's going to start dismantling apartheid, because things have become untenable. He's probably going to go up there and say, you know, things have become untenable here in South Africa, and we are going to change the system. They expected him to say that. And everybody was watching, the West and the East and the South Africans. We didn't have a television at the time, so I remember our family went to another lady and we sat in front of the television to watch the president's address and to see what this big news is that's coming, because it had been hyped for quite a while. As it turned out, he said, no, we're not dismantling apartheid. In fact, we're going to tighten the screws, and we're going to give you even more apartheid. And we're going to declare a state of emergency. And everybody was, They were so shocked. The international community was very shocked. And, when Nixon had his speech in August 1971, it was a bit of the same thing, because people knew a big announcement was coming, and they thought, well, perhaps he's going to announce some sort of truce with the Soviet Union so that the Cold War can tone down, or maybe he's going to escalate the Cold War and say, you know, we're going to build nuclear bases on the Soviet border. Not that they hadn't already done that with NATO. Or maybe he was going to say, we're going to withdraw from Vietnam. It's just not worth it. So there was a lot of reason for them to watch. And as everybody sat down and watched the address, the message was quite simple and very shocking. He said where the dollar is going off the gold standard. The dollar will no longer be pegged to gold the way it was agreed at Bretton Woods in 1944. Shockwaves reverberated around the world because if you look at the effects of this, what it means is that the dollar now becomes a fiat currency. Now, you might have heard the word fiat currency, and at the risk of insulting your knowledge about these things, I'm just going to explain briefly that, and in simple terms, that a fiat currency means the currency isn't linked to anything real in this world. It's only linked to the government's promise. And when you think about it philosophically, that's a very big deal because there's a finite amount of gold. There's only that much gold in the world, and most of it's in vaults, and then some of it is still there in the mines, but they always have sort of an idea how much gold there are in the mines, and most of the gold in the world had been mined from South Africa, and we're running dry. We barely have an ounce of gold left, and that's why one of the reasons the company, apart from silly regulations from our government, but one of the reasons that the gold companies are moving away from South Africa is because it's just not worth getting the gold out anymore. It's too deep, it's too difficult to get. But gold is finite, and if you link something to gold, at least you know it's connected to a metal, a precious metal that had a huge value for 10,000 years. It's been proven. We believe in gold. But now suddenly it's a fiat currency, and all we have for it is a government's promise. And you know what the thing about a promise is? It's infinite. Humans are incredibly imaginative creatures, so we can imagine an infinite amount of promises to make. You can promise absolutely anything. And every election cycle we see that. Politicians making promises, and most of those promises are not kept, and everybody goes like, wasn't there that promise? Oh, it's time to vote again, and then we go and vote for the same thing, or for a new guy who also won't keep his promises. It's the way it is with promises. But be that as it may, now we link currencies to promises. And it really frees up the American economy. And other nations knew that, and they didn't want to be left behind. So very soon after that, many countries walked off whatever standard there was and made their currencies fiat currencies. The Brits had already done that, I think, by the 30s. They had walked off the gold standard. But so all these countries made their own currencies fiat currencies, and so it's all just these promises floating around. And that's why you have ratings agencies. You might have heard of Standard and Poor and Fitch and Moody's, the ratings agencies. And the reason we need these ratings agencies is because, before them, you just needed a guy to go and count the gold bars in the vaults in Fort Knox or in the Reserve Bank and know, all right, that's how much gold there is. This is how many notes can be printed based on the gold that is there. But now, since we're not hooked on gold anymore, or linked to gold, now you have these agencies who have to go investigate these governments and see how able they are to make good on their promises. And our government is certainly not good for its own promises, which is why we're rated junk by a few, and we'll probably have full junk coming our way in the not too distant future. But and you might think that the United States is top rated, but it's not. It's a notch or two below the best rating. For the best rating, you need to go to West Europe. My ancestors from 350 years ago, they're tight with money, and they can give you the best rate. But these rating agencies rate the government, and they get stamped with a rate. So if you're going to invest in another country, big bucks in another country, you always have to look at their rating, and that's going to give you an idea as to whether it's a good idea, what your level of risk is. And even though America is not rated, is not in the top rating, is a notch or two below the top rating, their power, their military power, their economic power, and their political influence does change the game a bit. And so, yeah, they're a good investment. It's fine. But still, it's promises. And because there are infinite promises, you can print infinite monies, infinite dollars in this case. One thing that you should also know is you have the South African Reserve Bank. and you have the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the states, of the United States. But they're private institutions. You should know this. They're not government institutions. In fact, most reserve banks, central banks, have at some point been private banks. Many of them have been nationalized. The Brits nationalized the Bank of England as late as the 1990s. I think it was. I might be wrong. I should have checked this before the presentation, but it's something like that. But the Bank of Japan and the South African Reserve Bank and the Federal Reserve of the United States are private institutions. Now, if the government wants to print money based on a promise, in other words, just fake money, money out of thin air, it's not based in anything real, they ask the Federal Reserve to do it, and it's a lot more complex than this, but I'm going to keep it simple, otherwise I'm going to be sitting here for hours. But basically, if you print $1, it costs money to print the dollar. The Federal Reserve needs to make money as well. So say it costs a cent to print the dollar. So you have $1, and by the time you have the dollar, you already have less. But by the time the government has the dollar, they already have less because it's $1.01. But they only have $1. So it's theoretically and practically impossible for them to get out of debt. Not only that, because the money is not linked to anything real, it's only linked to promises, and it builds up and it builds up and it builds up. It builds beyond the capability of any government to pay it down. And this is what you have in the world at the moment. Now, why did I start with Saudi Arabia, with Arabia, which then became Saudi Arabia? Well, in 1971, when the United States walked off the gold standard, suddenly the dollars were not so much in demand, and they had to ensure that people get, because even though the dollar is not pegged to gold, if it is then less than the previous value, you can still give your dollars back and get your gold for something more secure. But 2 years later, in 1973, the United States made a very nice deal with Saudi Arabia, who at the time were pumping out the oil, and it was discovered that these guys really have the most oil in the world. It's a wonderful thing, and everybody needs their oil, and they're very centrally located, near all the big economies, near to Europe, and this is a great deal. So America said to the Saudis, we will give you political and economic and military protection, but you have to sell all your oil in dollars, which means if Saudi Arabia sells oil to Turkey or to Brazil or to any other nation, they have to do so in dollars. So suddenly all these nations are incentivized again to get dollars. They have to buy dollars some way or another, get them with gold or with something else, and then they buy their oil from Saudi Arabia. And also one thing that you must understand about oil is, and about all commodities in fact, is that if you're Colombia and you're right next to Venezuela, you don't buy all your oil from Venezuela. You still buy oil from Saudi Arabia and from Canada and maybe the US. And the reason for that is if something happens to Venezuela and you can't get the oil out of there, suddenly you're stuck. So we have the same thing here in South Africa. Let's just take maize as an example. South Africa generally produces enough maize to consume for ourselves, so we export maize, but we still import maize. And that's because we have to keep these channels open, because if there's a big drought or a locust plague, then suddenly we don't have any maize, and then we need to have those open channels so that we have established relationships with countries and established flows of transportation, and we can import more maize. Now it's the same with oil. So all countries, not all countries, but most countries still get oil from Saudi Arabia now, as they did then, but now it has to be bought in oil. Now I just want to throw one little piece of information in here at this stage. This might be a good time. What do Libya and Iraq and Iran and North Korea and Russia and Syria, Venezuela, did I mention Venezuela? What do they all have in Libya? What do they all have in common? Well, they're not all oil producing countries, because North Korea doesn't do too well in that department. Well, what they all have in common is that they're all in trouble. That's the one thing, because if you have oil, you have trouble. There are very few nations who have oil who do not have trouble. The powers that be will make sure of that. But what those countries all have in common is that they tried to walk off the dollar standard for oil. It's called the petrodollar. And that's the axis of evil. There is nothing more evil than wanting to walk off the dollar standard for your oil. And then very soon, through massive smear campaigns and propaganda, these countries are made to look even worse than they are. And they become enemies of the state because they're trying to figure out ways to not trade oil with US dollars, because they don't want to use the US dollars because they don't have a good vibe with the US. So it's an interesting thing to bear in mind. However, let's get back to Saudi Arabia. So the US made a wonderful deal with Saudi Arabia, ensured that there was a demand for dollars to be used around the world. But if the whole world is using the dollars and you don't have that much gold, and it doesn't matter because you're not pegged to gold, what do? You keep printing money. Now, the US national debt at this stage, and these are huge figures, the US national debt, when Barack Obama got into office, after the huge crash of 2008, just after that, he really inherited a horrible little legacy, economic legacy there. He had to fix something, but he fixed it with relative ease. Because you remember that crash in 2008, it was sort of, whoa, it's a big crash, the whole world's coming to an end, okay, everything's fine. Everybody cruises along merrily. For your average John in the streets, it's just, no, it was a crash, but I remember there was something, but we're okay. What happened was the Federal Reserve went into super money printing mode. And the US national debt when Barack Obama went into office was around 10 trillion. It's more or less these figures. It was around $10 trillion. $10 trillion. You know how much that is? It's you have $1, $1, and then you have $1 million, $1 million. Most people will never see $1 million in their lives. And then you take that $1 million and you put 1,000 heaps of $1 million each. And then you have another 1,000 of those heaps of $1 million. That's $1 trillion. And it's 10 of those heaps. That's how much the US national debt was. It's an inconceivably huge amount of money. During his tenure, Barack Obama managed to up the US debt from around $10 trillion to around $19 trillion. He just about doubled it. Wow, that's a lot of fake money out there. And Donald Trump, also being no slouch, he's also went into full-on money printing mode, and at the moment the US national debt is something like $23.5 trillion. That is so much money of nothing. It's a lot of hot air. It's a debt trap out of which the US can never get. And they're not even the guys that are deepest in troubles. Japan is even worse. They also have sorry, but they have these wonderful printers that just print the money in a very big way. And of course, it has to be managed well, because if you print too much money, you do what Bob Mugabe did. And you have notes that are worth 20 billion. Sorry. You have notes that are worth $20 billion, and you can hardly buy a slice of bread with that. I have a 20 billion Zim dollar note at home. It's a cute thing to have, and that's what happens usually in hyperinflation countries. They really print a lot of money because they need a lot of money. And the reason why America hasn't hit super inflation, actually it's a very complex thing. And I wish maybe I should one day do a presentation and get into that. But there's so much about it on the internet that I don't want to really regurgitate information that's out there already. I'd rather give you some sort of semi-original spin on what's happening in the world, which is why I'm here. But the reason America is not in that much trouble yet, even though it's printing money more than Bob Mugabe printed money, is because of the threat. Because they're strong, they're economically very strong, and they're militarily very strong, and they have a lot of political influence. So it's still working out, but it cannot go on like this. And there's nothing to indicate that it's going to change at any rate. And for most of his tenure, I was convinced that Donald Trump would be elected a second term. I still hold that position, but with some reservations, because we'll have to see how this corona thing plays out. But if it doesn't play out too badly, then he will definitely get a second term. I'm very convinced of that, as much as I was that he would get his first term. And I think by the end of his second term, should there be a second term, America's going to be around $30 trillion in debt, unless something happens. Now, I want to take you back to 2008, just to briefly, and this is a very, very layman's explanation of what happened in 2008, but it really works like this. You're a bank, and there are 100 guys who each deposit $1 in your bank. So you have $100, which means you have $100 to work with. And then some guy, but you have to also give these 100 guys interest on the $100. You have to do that because they're not putting it there for free. They want interest, 3% or 1% or 10%, depending where in the world you are and how high risk your investment is. But now a guy comes to you and he says, no, he wants to borrow $100. So as a bank, you're like, well, I have $100, but what if these people want their money back? But statistically, we know that people will never want, not more than 80%, or no more than 20% will want their money back within the next year. So you're like, okay, I will lend you this money, and you have to pay it back, and these are the terms. You have to give us interest because that's how banks make money, and definitely with service costs as well, cheapers. But you're taking a risk. Because if these people suddenly all want their money back, you can't give their money to them. And then what you do as a bank is you go to another bank and you say, listen, these people owe me. I have these people. These people are invested in my bank. I have their money, but I've actually lent it all out. Yes, lend. I've always lend and borrow. It's so confusing. So can you vouch for me, other bank, that should I ever come short, if these people want their money back, that you can help me? And that bank says, yes, sure, we can make a deal, and you can do the same for us. And I'm like, yes, I can do it for you. And then another bank gets, and another bank gets in on it. And eventually some banks were 10 and even higher times over the actual amount of money they had. They were lending out fake money, air money. It's just a piece of paper. Yes, here you go. And the next time you invite someone to your house, just make sure you're not lying to them. Because if you still have a mortgage on that house, it's not your house. You have to say, my dear friends, would you come for dinner at the bank's house tonight? The bank's house that I'm residing in at 4th Street, number 22. Because that's the reality of it. It's not, and the bank holds the papers. You don't have the paper. If you still have a mortgage, you don't have the papers to your house. Once you pay down that mortgage, then the bank's going to be like, oh, you want your papers? You want us to keep it in safekeeping for you? That's how it works. So the bank has the house, and then if you default on your loan, then the bank has to sell the house again, often on an auction, sometimes at a bit of a loss. I've bought houses like that in the past at a loss because it was on auction because of a bank. But so the banks lend more and more, and way more, 10 times more, and more than 10 times more than the actual money they have. And then some guy gets nervous and he wants it because he sees there's a bubble and someone whispers something and there's a bit of a ripple in the markets because some newscaster said something, and some guy's like, he's the first to get his money back. And then you come to his house or to the bank's house for dinner and he tells you, no, I got my money out of that thing because I think there's a problem. And then the guy's like, oh, should I get my money as well? He's like, well, I would recommend that. And so it goes, and everybody suddenly wants their money and there's not enough money to go around, and the bank collapses. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, can you believe the weird names for banks? But those were the banks, the two huge home loan sort of banks that fell flat on their faces. And they were institutions that had been around for quite a while. But then who saves the banks? The American government. And how does the American government get its money apart from the money that it prints? It gets it from taxpayers. So eventually the taxpayers have to rescue the banks, and then the banks have huge parties and they get champagne and they get J-Lo to sing at their party and pay her a ton of money as well. And that's just the way it is. But basically, this is what has happened in 2008, and there was a way to rescue them. But the governments, so many governments of the world, are at the moment in a similar situation. They have created money, little papers like the bank, and lent money, which is like giving it to other nations for investments, way in excess of their ability to pay it back or to vouch for the true value of that money. So they're also in a bubble. You've heard of that before. So in 2008, the banks and the markets were in a bubble, and right now the governments, and they have been for some time, in a massive bubble. And it's easier to sustain that bubble because a government can print the money. The bank can't print the money. The bank can just lie about the money it has and give you a paper, which is a lot like printing money. But the bank can't use violence against another nation, or take another oil field, or do something, cause some international problem. Well, at least I hope they can't. I think they can't. Maybe they can. But we're in a similar situation with the banks at the moment, with the governments at the moment. That's the one thing to bear in mind. The other thing to bear in mind is that, where was I? It was 2008 was a big deal. And then fake money. Damn, I interrupted myself and I've lost track. But anyway, so yes, the governments are deeply in debt. And what they need is, oh yes, this is the thing I wanted to say. They need a reset. They need a reset. And fortunately, we've had a trial run, because a few years ago, the World Bank forgave the incredible debts of so many third world countries. Now, if this is a politically incorrect term to you, I apologize. I don't mean it as such. But countries that, or emerging economies, or developing nations, that owed the World Bank tons of money, because the World Bank has been investing in them, and it became so problematic that these countries could not only never pay that money back, they could hardly keep up with the interest on those payments, and that stifled their ability to grow economically. So the World Bank gave them the money in the first place to develop themselves. Most of the money went into corruption, sorry to say, but it went into corruption, and it went into misadministration. And because you can't give, no matter how much money you give to someone who doesn't know what to do with that money, it's not going to work. And the money didn't always get to the right people. So these nations were in deep trouble. They got huge sums of money, which was not converted into a sensible economic practice with which to generate money and eventually pay back the loan with the interest as well, and then go on their merry way as a developed nation. And Bono from U2, he was one of the figures at the time promoting the idea. He was in many ways the face, the human face of this movement. But they managed to do it. And many countries had their debt written off by the World Bank. Billions and billions and billions of dollars that suddenly it's like, okay, we'll just forget about that because it wasn't real money to begin with. And now we have exactly the same situation here in the world with these banks, with these central banks of many governments. So we need an economic reset. And the problem with an economic reset is you can't let that guy do it first, and then this guy does it, and then that guy does it. It won't work because everybody's waiting for the first guy to fall and looking for ways to capitalize on that. It has to happen simultaneously. So one good way to achieve that is to release a virus into the world. And if you don't want to release a virus into the world, because you certainly can, there are many governments who can do that, but let's say they're so moral that they would never consider doing that, then you just wait for a virus to come along, because there is seasonal flu, and then sometimes it's particularly virulent, and then sometimes there is this one strain that is really a scary one, and we've had a few of those through in recent history with what was it, H1N1 and SARS. So we have our experience with that, and then what you do is you hype the hell out of that virus. It needs to be a pretty virulent virus, but you also really need to hype the hell out of it, because I'm not making any statement on how dangerous the COVID-19 virus is. I'm not making any statements on that. But what I am saying is that if it takes a lot of lives, more than seasonal flu, because at the moment it's, at the time that I was making this recording, about 15,000, 16,000 worldwide deaths. But the seasonal flu deaths are 105,000. So it's still catching up to the annual seasonal flu deaths rate. And if it doesn't take a lot of lives, then it's either one of two things. It wasn't that serious, or it was very serious, but all the measures that had been put in place were effective. So that's the way it's going to work. But what are you achieving? You're destroying the world economy. Now, as it is, the world economy has already taken a massive beating in recent weeks, and if this thing carries on for a few months, it's going to be a really, really big beating. Let's just look around for some conspiracy theories. Some people say, yes, China did it. That doesn't really make sense. Why would China do it? Because firstly, it cost a lot of their lives. Okay, they don't have a great record caring for their people, as some of their leaders in the past have proven, killing off millions and millions and millions of people. Real people, not fake people, not fiat people, real people. But it really hurt their economy, and that doesn't make sense. And then you can say, yes, but they did it to hurt the Western economies, and now the proof is there, because the Western economies have suffered a lot more than the Chinese economy. But that doesn't make sense either, because China is the factory of the world. They are the producers, man. Everything and everybody's stuff comes from China. And how can China sell their stuff if it's not being bought? Because these countries can't afford to buy it. So that doesn't make sense. Then some people say, yes, no, it was America who planted the virus, and that doesn't make sense either, because to make America great again. But that doesn't make sense either, because America's hurting from it now. And if this was done by America, certainly not by Donald Trump, because it might prove a huge obstacle in his course to a second term, or on his way to a second term. I kind of like the idea of Russia. Aren't I just a good Democrat now? Yes, Russia, let's bring the Russia hoax back. You know, the most experienced, smartest politician in the world today is Vladimir Putin. Because you see, the thing about American presidents is they don't really know much, you know, because they work themselves up through the system, and then they become president for 4 years, and then maybe for 8 years, but if they're Jimmy Carter or George Bush, only for 4 years. And recently they've really gotten into the habit of getting these long-term presidents. What it was, Bill Clinton did 2 terms, and then after him it was George W. Bush, who also had 2 terms, and then Barack Obama had 2 terms. And so they're going for the long haul, and that makes sense. It's actually wiser. America, you're learning. Because what can you do in 4 years? Not much. You spend most of it's like a cricketer. South Africans, you understand the cricket metaphor. You're standing at the cricket pitch, and when you're the opening batsman, the ball is hard. The track is fast. The bowlers are fit, and so the ball comes at you at a hell of a speed. So you just spend your time blocking so that the bowlers can get tired, so that the pitch can get a bit soft, and so that the ball can get a bit soft, and then you can start scoring. And that's the end of your first term. Now you're ready to start whacking, and they vote another guy in. But Vladimir Putin has been the leader for a long time, 20 years. And so he knows the game. He's smarter than any other politician because he has the experience. That's why you need experience in a sport team. Maybe the guy's a bit slower, you know, he's a bit old, and he's got some niggles, you know, he's got some injuries. But it's good to have that old experienced guy in the team because he's seen it all before. So yes, Vladimir Putin, he's a very smart guy, and he has a lot of experience, and he's a better politician than any of his contemporaries in the world because he's just been around that long, playing at a very high level. So maybe he did it. Maybe he was like, no, he wants to shake up the world order. and the whole financial system. And he's well positioned to do that because he's got gold. The Russian ruble is backed by gold to a greater extent than any Western nation. So they have lots of gold, and they've got a solid base to work from. They're also the wealthiest country in the world. And when I say the wealthiest country in the world, I mean in terms of what's in the soil. Firstly, they're twice as big as the United States, and they have everything. Anything you can want from the ground, from deep under, from a mine, they've got it. Loads of gas, loads of oil, and they supply gas to Western and oil to Western Europe. And they're right next to the country with the biggest people's economy, which is China. They have so many people, 1.5 billion people in China. So the Russians are very well positioned. And if they shake up the whole thing, it breaks the hegemony of the West a bit. So there's a good reason for Putin to have been the guy to do it that way. But I like the idea that it has more to do with a global reset of the markets, a global reset of financial systems, a global reset of currency, because it's not sustainable. The way it's going now, it's not sustainable, and it's going to crash sooner or later, and it's going to be very embarrassing as well. So why not have it happen this way? The whole world goes into lockdown mode because of a virus, regardless of how strong the virus is, because at this stage it's not about that. It's about the consequences, the economic consequences, and that is all I have to say about the corona. No, it's not really all I have to say. Let's say some more. Let's say, what are the effects going to be of the coronavirus? Well, firstly, the markets are falling, and people are going to have to recover from this. And if this sticks around for another month or two, it's going to be a lot worse than 2008, and that was pretty bad. Even though John in the street didn't feel it, the markets felt it, and the long-term effects are durable. Another very impact is on democracy. You realize that you can't vote at this stage. So there is effectively a moratorium on democracy because we can't have voting stations, we can't have election rallies. So here, through this virus and the hype that we've created around it, and the hype has caused the government to say this and this and this is going to happen, suddenly we live in a democratic country, but we have no democracy, and there is no way to exercise democratic right. If there was going to be an election now, an election cycle now, it would have stopped. There's no way it can go on. So that's the impact it has on democracy. At the same time, I'm extremely disappointed to see some people who have professed their libertarian credentials on social media here in South Africa for a very long time, who are now just demanding authority and demanding some ruler do something. Chicken shites, really, come on, people. And it's amazing that ideology is something that you can talk about in front of your computer and go like, yes, I believe. But when the paw hits the fan, then suddenly we're not so libertarian anymore. There's no room for libertarianism. It's a disgrace, and it's very embarrassing. Principle, circumstances alter cases, but circumstances should not alter principles. Another huge impact, think about pension funds. The coronavirus, COVID-19, it takes old people, it takes the lives of old people. And so there's a lot of old people who won't be taking a pension from the state. Now, it's a horrible thing to invest in. It's not something I'm encouraging. My own mother is 83 years old, and I want her to live for a long time. But it is true that if a huge section of the older population suddenly pass away, there's going to be that relief for the state coffer. Also people with compromised immune systems. Although here in South Africa we have many, percentage-wise, we might be right there at the top in the world in terms of people with a compromised immune system. I'm talking about people who are HIV positive, and then we have all these drug-resistant strains of infections in our hospitals that are not running very well. And then we have tuberculosis is a big killer here in South Africa. So we have people with compromised immune systems, but I think one has to be sure that ARVs don't actually help the case, that not that many people will pass away. Maybe that's what's going to happen. Yes, speaking of ARVs, the medical industry. Now, personally, I've never really been closely tied to the medical industry because it's just my background. I've I'm 50 years old. I've never in my life had any form of medical insurance. It's not something I've ever looked into. It's not something I've needed. Well, I've stared death in the eyes on quite a few occasions, and it was never nice, but I survived. And here I am, and it's a personal thing, you know. I'm not telling you what to do, but for me personally, my faith system and the way I work, I'm okay with that. But we are under huge pressure at the moment in the world to commit to the medical industry and to put our health in their hands. And you know, people talk about healthcare. Healthcare is not healthcare. It's health is to eat well, is to drink well, is to breathe well, to get exercise and get a lot of sleep and not stress. That is how you become a healthy person, not by drinking another pill. That thing that you call healthcare, that is the medical machine, the markets of medical machines. I'm not talking down on, because listen, the medical guys have the right to exist, just like the second-hand car dealer. But when you go buy it from the second-hand car dealer, do you take his word? It's like, no. When he tells you this is the best car he's ever had 3 years, it's like, yeah, take that with a pinch of salt, because at the end of the day, he wants to sell a car. And even if the second-hand car dealer is a very moral person, they still serve their own interests and then find a way to morally support your interests as well. So it's not necessarily all bad, but why is it that the broker and the car salesman and the plumber and all these people are subject to that rule of humanity, but not the doctor, not the medical? I mean, really? Just think about it, and don't expect any human to not be human, because if you do that, you are certain to get hurt somewhere along the line. Another consequence is, maybe a year from now we'll read about a lot of babies being born, because now we have all this time, people in lockdown, past the time, how about it? And so it's going to be interesting to see if there was a bit of a baby boom, a bit of a spike in new births 9 months or 10 months from now. That'll be interesting to see. What else was there? Okay, rights and freedoms. That is very bad news, because our freedoms are in jeopardy. At once, suddenly we don't have the freedom. What's happening with that light? At once, we don't have the freedom to move about as we want to move about. And that is really very worrying. It's the kind of stuff that belongs in an autocracy. And yes, you can say, yes, but we need to do it for this. We need it to... I don't care what the reason is. You understand, for me, there is no reason, because it has to do with the freedom of your movement. Why don't you get the old people, try to convince them to stay, because they're the most vulnerable, and it's been proven that a lot of younger people are going to be okay. Bye-bye, light. And why don't you have the younger folks walking around with masks? There's so many things you can do. But this is a massive exercise in state control. And I think I need to do a presentation on state control. Yes, I think I will. Anyway, just a few thoughts to leave you with, none of which I'm willing to commit to, but it's nice to think about these things and to know about these things. Basically, I think it's, I think the whole, I'm fine. Of course I'm fine. And I hope you're fine as well. I hope you stay healthy. I hope you use this time at home very well, to be with your family, to rediscover reading, to rediscover your children if you're a parent, to rediscover your parents if you're living with them, to play some games, to do some activities. Take the TV remote, throw it away. Keep the TV away for a while. I really think that's very healthy. Listen to some music. If you have a vinyl player, take out the old vinyl, because those are all very wholesome things. And I wish you all very good health.